It was a cold November morning, and the sun seemed to have forgotten to rise. The streets of Cedar Creek, a quiet town without much excitement, remained blanketed in a thick fog, as if something dark was about to happen. And it was. The phone rang at the local police station just before 8. Officer Ryan Cooper answered, expecting another routine call. But that wasn't what he heard. On the other end of the line, a trembling voice belonging to a tenant from an old building on 7th Avenue reported something disturbing. The smell, she said, was unbearable. It was coming from apartment 303. No one had seen the man who lived there in weeks, and now the neighbors feared the worst. Cooper jotted down the details, already anticipating what was to come. Deaths in lonely apartments were nothing new to him, but something in the woman's description, the shaky tone, the insistence that something else was wrong, sent a chill through him. When he arrived at the building, Cooper found exactly what he expected. The foul stench of decomposition filled the air. The janitor, a thin, pale man, avoided Cooper's eyes as he handed over the apartment key. I never talked to him. Nobody did. He always kept his curtains shut. He was strange, the janitor said, quickly stepping away. The sound of the door unlocking echoed through the narrow hallway. As Cooper pushed the door open, the smell hit him like a wall. There, on the living room floor, lay the body. The man had been dead for weeks. His face, pale and distorted by decomposition, was almost unrecognizable. But what caught Cooper's attention wasn't the corpse, it was what was around it. Photographs. Dozens of them, scattered across the floor and plastered on the walls, forming a macabre mosaic. The images showed familiar faces. Missing women. Cooper recognized them immediately. The cases had been circulating through the department for months, young women, all missing mysteriously around Cedar Creek. And now, here they were, staring back at him from the photographs in apartment 303. He stepped back, trying to process what he was seeing. None of it made sense. Why would this dead man have pictures of these women? Was he responsible for their disappearances? Or was there something more? Cooper's mind raced as he called for backup. That's when Sarah Mendez came into the picture. The lead investigator of cold cases, with her sharp, calculating eyes, arrived at the scene minutes later. With over a decade of experience, Sarah had seen her fair share of disturbing scenes, but even she felt uneasy when she entered the apartment. The scene was meticulously chaotic. Every photo seemed placed almost ritualistically. There were no signs of struggle, no indication that the man had been murdered. It seemed like he had simply stopped living. His body was in an advanced state of decay, but the mystery surrounding him was still fresh. Sarah walked closer to the wall covered in photos. Her eyes scanned each face, and a sense of urgency began to build. This wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. There was something in this scene she hadn't yet figured out, but she knew she had to act fast. Time, as always, was against her. As the forensics team began their work, Sarah reflected on the dead man. Who was he, really? A recluse, a bystander, or a predator? The lack of information about him was a void that needed to be filled. Apartment 303 had now become the epicenter of a mystery much larger than anyone could have anticipated. Stepping outside to catch her breath, Sarah looked up at the closed windows of the apartment. Something was wrong here. Very wrong. This wasn't just the scene of an isolated death. No. This was the beginning of something much bigger, much darker. And she was now at the center of it. Apartment 303 had quickly become the focal point of the investigation, but there were more questions than answers. The dead man had been identified as Arthur Hale, a reclusive photographer, practically invisible to the building's residents. He had no close family, no visitors, and by all accounts, no friends. He was a shadow in the everyday life of Cedar Creek, someone everyone saw but no one truly knew. Sarah's first stop was at the records department. She needed to uncover who Arthur Hale was, how he lived, and why a man like him would possess so many photos of missing women. The search yielded few answers. Arthur had moved into the building 7 years earlier. He had no criminal record, no complaints against him, no interactions with the police, at least, not until now. His past was a mystery, as opaque as the curtains in his apartment, always drawn shut. The neighbors had little to say, and what they did say was superficial. Helen Carter, the woman in apartment 305, described Arthur as polite but always distant. He never said hello in the hallway, but he also never caused trouble, she explained, with a hint of discomfort. She mentioned hearing strange noises sometimes, but never paid much attention. To her, Arthur Hale was just another solitary figure in a sea of them. James Morris, the elderly man who lived downstairs, claimed to have seen a few women visiting apartment 303. Not many, but I remember seeing a couple come up, mostly at night, he said, his eyebrows furrowing. I thought he was one of those artistic types, you know, a photographer. But now, I'm not so sure. Sarah, however, knew that these were valuable pieces of information. Arthur hadn't been as isolated as he seemed. He had visitors, and now those visitors were missing. A crucial detail emerged when Sarah examined the few belongings left in the man's apartment. Among his photography equipment were old cameras, unfinished film, and rolls of negatives that hadn't yet been developed. She called in a forensic technician to process the film, but that would take time. Sarah needed immediate answers. As she sifted through the police files, Sarah found another intriguing fact. 4 of the missing women had been last seen within 3 blocks of the building where Arthur lived. Emily Donovan, a 25-year-old waitress at a local cafe, was one of the first. Her disappearance had caused a stir in the community but was soon overshadowed by other cases. Then there was Laura Jenkins, a university student who vanished on her way home from the library. More recently, Catherine Ward and Tina Rogers had disappeared under similar circumstances. Previous investigations had failed to connect these cases, but now Sarah began to see a pattern. The women disappeared near the building, and somehow, all the clues pointed back to apartment 303. While the police continued analyzing the data, Sarah decided to speak with someone who might offer more insight into Arthur Hale's behavior. Susan Harding, a middle-aged woman who lived 1 floor below, had always kept a more critical eye on her neighbors. He was weird, always carrying those cameras around, and I thought he might be taking pictures without our permission. I saw flashes of light at night, but I could never prove it, she said, with a trace of bitterness. He didn't mix with anyone. He never came to the building meetings. He just stayed up there like the world didn't matter. That was Arthur Hale's life, a solitary existence, shrouded in mystery. But as Sarah listened to these accounts, something in her gut told her this wasn't the full story. Hale may have been a recluse, but the visits from women and his cameras pointed to something more sinister. He could have been documenting something, or worse, controlling those women before they vanished. Sarah continued to contemplate Arthur's psychological profile. The photos were the key, but a critical piece of the puzzle was still missing. Who were the women coming and going from his apartment? Were they aware of the danger? Or had Hale lured them somehow? The feeling that he hadn't acted alone started to take shape. This conspiracy went far beyond a lonely man with a camera. The patterns suggested a larger network, something coordinated. Hale might have been a pawn, someone controlled by larger forces, or perhaps, one of the sickest minds Cedar Creek had ever seen. The question was, how to connect these pieces before it was too late. At that moment, as Sarah pondered, a new lead emerged. John Harris, a rookie officer, appeared at the station with a forgotten file. It was a report from 2 years ago, where an anonymous tip had mentioned Arthur Hale. A young woman had reported feeling like she was being followed by a man who seemed to carry a camera at all times. The case had been shelved due to a lack of solid evidence, and the suspect's name was never recorded. But now, as Sarah reread the report, it seemed to hold far more weight than before. What if the young woman who had filed the report was one of the missing? What if she had tried to warn the authorities, but her voice had been ignored? Sarah knew she needed to dig deeper, to search for patterns in old complaints, and to see if there were more connections that might have been overlooked. Back at the building, the investigation into the apartment continued. The neighbors were starting to open up more now that Arthur Hale's name was circulating in the news. However, no one seemed to know where he came from. He seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, like a ghost with no past. A living shadow among the walls of Cedar Creek. But for Sarah, this mystery only made the truth more sinister. The less they knew about Hale, the deeper the hole he was hiding in. Now, with conflicting leads and a web of unanswered questions, Sarah Mendez was more convinced than ever that Arthur Hale was only the tip of an iceberg far more dangerous and complicated than just the disappearance of a few women. The real question she needed to answer was, who was pulling the strings from the other side? Apartment 303 was still pulsing as the dark center of the mystery, but with each step forward, Sarah realized the layers of secrets went deeper than she had initially thought. While waiting for the results of the films found in the apartment, Sarah immersed herself in every detail she could find. What she hadn't expected was that a casual discovery would soon change everything. The forensic team had finished their initial sweep of the apartment and, while digging deeper, they found something that seemed out of place, a small safe hidden behind one of the bookshelves. The safe was old and rusted, as if it hadn't been opened in years. The combination was easy to crack, and what was inside was more disturbing than Sarah could have imagined. Inside the safe were a series of letters, all handwritten. They were short, direct, and the contents raised more questions than answers. The letters were signed by someone only identified as the mentor. The handwriting was cold, almost mechanical, and the instructions were clear. Arthur was to follow and observe the women, capture their images, but never act without the mentor's permission. Sarah frowned as she read through the notes. The handwriting was meticulously neat, without hesitation, without emotion. This was the first concrete evidence that Arthur Hale hadn't been acting alone. He was a piece, possibly manipulated, in a much larger, darker operation. But who was the mentor? And what was the end goal? The questions swirled in Sarah's mind as she sifted through the rest of the items in the safe. Among the letters were photos that hadn't been seen before, carefully tucked away in envelopes as if they were waiting for the right moment to be found. One of those photos caught her attention immediately. It wasn't one of the missing women she recognized. It was a different young woman, with dark brown hair and strikingly deep eyes. There was no name, no identification, but her face looked familiar to Sarah, as if she had seen her somewhere before. The discomfort gnawed at her. She knew she needed to dig deeper to identify this new woman, and fast. Back at the station, the forensic team was busy processing the photographic films and negatives. Sarah was growing impatient, hoping for something new to surface, a clue that would lead straight to the heart of this tangled web. When a technician finally called her name, she realized what they had found could be the missing piece. "You're going to want to see this," said the technician, his face pale as he handed her a series of freshly developed photos. The images showed the missing women, but not just portraits. The photos captured the last moments of these women's lives, walking alone, crossing deserted streets, leaving their jobs. They were meticulous records, as if someone had been watching them closely. There was something deeply unsettling about each image, as though the photographer had relished in capturing not just their forms but their vulnerabilities. Among the photos, one sequence stood out. Emily Donovan, the missing waitress, was photographed leaving the cafe where she worked. But the last image in the sequence was the one that chilled Sarah's blood. It showed Emily looking directly at the camera, as if she had realized she was being followed. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with fear, and then, nothing. There were no more images. The sequence ended abruptly, as if something had interrupted the photographer. Sarah felt the weight of that image. Emily knew. Somehow, she had realized what was happening. That final photo wasn't just a clue, it was a cry for help. Sarah now knew for sure that the women weren't just random victims. They were being watched, monitored by someone meticulous, someone who planned every detail. And Arthur Hale, however involved he was, wasn't the mastermind behind it. He was following orders, just as the letters suggested. In the same set of photos, another detail made Sarah stop for a moment. A shadow in the background, almost imperceptible, in several of the images. It wasn't Arthur Hale. The figure was much taller, more robust. Someone had been watching the women alongside Arthur, someone lurking in the shadows, always present but never fully revealed. This confirmed the existence of the mentor, but now Sarah needed to prove it. As she processed these new insights, one thought wouldn't leave her mind. Who was the unknown woman in the photo found in the safe? If Arthur had been documenting the missing women, why didn't this woman appear in any of the reports? Why wasn't there any record of her? The familiarity of her face gnawed at Sarah. She had to find out who she was. After a quick search through public records and databases, Sarah found a possible answer. The woman in the photo appeared to match a woman named Leah Carter, an independent journalist who had worked on investigative cases years ago. Leah had fallen off the radar for some time, and the last news about her indicated she had disappeared suddenly while investigating unsolved crimes in Cedar Creek. The truth hit Sarah like a blow. Leah had been investigating the same disappearances when she vanished. This put everything into perspective. There wasn't just a web of crimes at play, but also a deliberate effort to silence anyone who got too close to the truth. Leah had gotten too close, and now she was missing, just like all the other women. But she wasn't in any official report. Why? Someone had ensured her disappearance didn't raise any alarms. Sarah found herself surrounded by questions without answers, and the web of intrigue seemed to be closing in on her. The mystery was deepening, and Sarah now had a new mission: to discover what happened to Leah Carter, to uncover who the mentor really was, and why Arthur Hale had become such an essential piece in this dark game. With each new discovery, Sarah felt she was getting closer to the truth, and closer to danger too. She knew that the further she ventured, the more the darkness would close in around her. The game had begun, and the clock was ticking against her. Sarah felt the weight of her discoveries as she returned to the building where Arthur Hale had lived. The photos, the cryptic letters, and Leah Carter's potential involvement only reinforced what she already suspected: Hale hadn't been acting alone. More importantly, he wasn't the mastermind behind all this. Someone else was controlling every move, orchestrating the disappearances of women with precise, chilling calculation. And now, with Jennifer's involvement, things were more personal. As the investigation progressed, Sarah began to notice something strange. In the days following the discovery in the safe, the feeling of being watched started to intensify. It wasn't paranoia. She had experienced the sensation before in other cases. But this time, the danger felt more real. Over the past few days, she'd noticed a black car parked just a few meters from her house. Once was a coincidence, but now, the same vehicle had appeared in at least 3 different locations where she had been. At first, she tried to ignore it, focusing on the case, but the sensation of being watched became constant. The figure lurking in the shadows of Hale's photos now seemed to be everywhere, and it was starting to affect her work. Sarah had always been a meticulous and analytical investigator, but the creeping fear invading her mind was making her uneasy. That afternoon, after a meeting with the coroner about Arthur Hale's exact cause of death, confirmed to be natural, with no signs of foul play, Sarah decided to stop by the apartment of her friend Jennifer, a journalist who often helped her gather unofficial information. Jennifer had been working on an article about the recent disappearances and had promised new leads. However, when Sarah arrived at Jennifer's house, something felt off. The front door was ajar, and the lights in the living room were off, which was unusual. As she stepped inside, Sarah called out Jennifer's name, but there was no answer. The house was eerily silent, and Sarah's instincts immediately kicked in. She drew her gun, every sense on high alert. Something was wrong, a quiet tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Cautiously, she moved down the hallway toward Jennifer's office. When she opened the door, she found the computer still on, files about the case open on the screen. But Jennifer was nowhere to be found. The chair was overturned, and papers were scattered across the floor. There were no signs of a struggle, but enough to tell Sarah that her friend was missing. A chill ran down her spine. Jennifer had been pulled into this mess. They had taken her too. This wasn't just an investigation into missing women anymore. It was personal, and Sarah knew that now she was also in the crosshairs of whoever was behind the disappearances. Jennifer's vanishing marked a turning point. The threat was much closer than Sarah had ever imagined. That same night, Sarah returned to the station, restless. She needed a plan, but her thoughts were consumed by Jennifer's disappearance. Something was wrong, something she hadn't anticipated. As she locked herself in the evidence room, trying to piece together the puzzle with the clues she had, her mind raced with unanswered questions. The mentor was watching her every move, knew who was getting too close, and knew when to strike to silence anyone who might expose the scheme. She glanced at the board covered with photos of the missing women, with Leah Carter's image in the center, the one she'd found in Hale's safe. All the pieces were there, but the connection between Arthur Hale, the mentor, and the women was still elusive. And now, Jennifer was part of this dark enigma. As she combed through the evidence once more, her phone rang. It was an unknown number, not unusual for a detective like her, but by this point, everything felt loaded with second meanings. When she answered, a man's voice, cold and calculating, spoke on the other end. "You're getting too close, detective. Stop now, before it's too late for you too." The call was brief, but its impact was deep. Sarah's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't some random threat. This was a direct, clear message from someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The message was unmistakable. The mentor knew every move Sarah was making. She was now a target. The tension was rising. The walls were closing in on her, but instead of retreating, Sarah felt her determination harden. It was now a matter of life and death, both for her and for Jennifer. And she couldn't, under any circumstances, afford to fail. Sarah knew that her next move had to take her back to the building. Apartment 303 was the epicenter of everything, but there were more mysteries buried in that place than just Arthur Hale. Jennifer's disappearance had turned this investigation into something personal, and the urgency had only grown. The voice on the phone echoed in her mind, "You're getting too close." Whoever it was, they were nearby, and now Sarah had to figure out how that building fit into this twisted puzzle. She decided to pay a visit to the old janitor, Samuel Royce, who had worked in the building for nearly 2 decades. If anyone knew more about the history of the place, it was him. When Sarah arrived at Samuel's house, she found him to be an aged man, his eyes tired with the weight of years. There was a certain reluctance in his posture as he spoke about the building and its tenants. "That place always had a heaviness, you know," he said, his voice raspy with a touch of caution. "People come and go, but some stories stick." Mr. Hale wasn't the first odd one to live there, and I doubt he'll be the last. The conversation seemed to be going nowhere until Samuel, with an uneasy expression, mentioned something curious. That building used to belong to someone else, you know? Before the current developer took over. It belonged to a man named Henry Maddox. He died, a few years back, and since then, things have only gotten worse. The place, it's never been the same. Henry Maddox. The name triggered a vague memory from the files Sarah had reviewed at the start of the case. Maddox had been a local businessman involved in several real estate ventures around town, but what stood out was the fact that when he died, much of his fortune mysteriously disappeared. There hadn't been any formal investigations, and the case had quickly faded from public attention. However, the building where Hale lived had once been one of his properties. That couldn't be a coincidence. Back at the building, Sarah focused her attention on the basement, a place that had been largely unexplored until now. The janitor had mentioned it casually, but something about the way he avoided talking about the area made her suspect there was more to uncover. As she descended into the basement, the atmosphere was dark and stifling, with the sense that time had stopped down there. The narrow, dimly lit corridors were unsettling. There were old, rusty doors, some locked, others ajar and empty, as if they'd long been abandoned. However, one door stood out. It was a heavy metal door, locked with a brand new padlock, something that sharply contrasted with the rest of the building's aging structure. The lock was a clear sign that someone was hiding something behind it. After a few minutes of prying with improvised tools, Sarah managed to break the lock and open the door. Behind it, a small room was revealed. It seemed to have once been a maintenance room, but now it was filled with equipment that didn't belong in a simple basement. Old surveillance cameras, monitors, and stacks of videotapes cluttered the room, as if it had been used to monitor the tenants. In the center of the room was a table covered in papers and photographs that immediately caught Sarah's attention. Photos of the same missing women, the same ones that had been found in Arthur Hale's apartment. But the most disturbing detail was a map of the building on the wall, with red circles marking specific apartments, including apartment 303. The map was connected by red strings to photos of people, forming a kind of diagram of connections. At the top, the name Henry Maddox stood out as the central figure in the entire web. There was something much larger going on here. Maddox, the former owner of the building, seemed to be at the heart of a conspiracy involving surveillance and control. But what was he after? And how had Arthur Hale, the reclusive photographer, gotten involved in this? Sarah began taking pictures of the room to document everything, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of it all. The feeling of being watched was now undeniable. As she sifted through the papers, she found something even more revealing, a list of names. It was a list of tenants, detailing their routines, habits, and, most chilling of all, their disappearances. The list included the women who had gone missing in recent years, but there was another name that stopped Sarah cold: Leah Carter, the journalist she had found in Hale's photos. Leah had been investigating this when she disappeared. Which meant she had gotten too close, just like Jennifer. And now, Sarah was on the exact same path. She pocketed the papers and quickly left the room, locking it behind her. The air in the building felt heavier, as if every step echoed with a sense of urgency. As Sarah made her way back to the surface, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching her every move. The entire building now seemed to conspire against her. Whoever was behind the surveillance network knew that Sarah was getting dangerously close to the truth, and she knew she was risking her life by continuing. Before leaving the building, Sarah noticed something strange across the street. The black car that had been following her was parked there again, its dark windows reflecting the building's facade. She froze for a moment, feeling the danger closer than ever. There was no time to waste. The next step would be critical. As she left, The sound of her footsteps echoed through the empty lobby, and Sarah knew that she was now at the center of the conspiracy. Every clue she had uncovered pointed to something bigger, something that went beyond Arthur Hale, beyond Henry Maddox. Now, Sarah needed to figure out who the true mentor was behind it all, before they found her first. Sarah left the building, her mind racing. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but the picture that was emerging was far more sinister than she had anticipated. The black car, still parked across the street, watched her, heightening her sense of impending danger. There was no doubt that the mentor knew her every move. The question now was, how far was he willing to go to ensure the truth was never revealed? As soon as she arrived back at the station, Sarah locked herself in her office, spreading out the papers and photos she had taken from the basement of the building. She needed a plan. She needed to understand how the building, Arthur Hale, Henry Maddox, and now the mentor were all connected. Each clue pulled her deeper into a web of conspiracies and crimes that seemed to involve all of Cedar Creek. As she reorganized her thoughts, the phone rang. It was John Harris, the young officer helping with the investigation. His voice was tense. "Sarah, I think you need to come over here. We've found something in the old files. It's about Henry Maddox, and someone close to you." A chill ran down her spine. Henry Maddox had been dead for years. How could he be connected to someone close to her? Sarah arrived at the station where Harris was and found a pile of old documents that had been recovered from storage. Henry Maddox, the former owner of the building, had been a powerful figure in Cedar Creek, with deep ties to the local elite, but his sudden death 7 years ago had never been investigated thoroughly. There was something in these documents that Sarah had never seen before, a name that wasn't directly related to Maddox, but that was linked to the surveillance network discovered in the basement. Harris pointed to a particular document. "Here, Sarah. This name, it's someone who's been around you the entire time. Patrick Wallace. He's the owner of the security company that installed the camera system in the building years ago. And more than that, he was Henry Maddox's personal consultant for years, managing the surveillance systems in several of his properties. He knew everything that was going on." Sarah froze. Patrick Wallace. The name wasn't unfamiliar. Patrick was someone she considered an ally in her investigations, a security expert she'd worked with on other cases. He always seemed willing to help but never got directly involved. Now, everything pointed to him being connected not only to Henry Maddox but to the sinister surveillance network involved in the disappearance of these women. The truth was starting to reveal itself. Wallace was more than just a security expert. He was a central piece in Maddox's operation and, possibly, the very mentor Sarah had been chasing. The discovery hit her like a blow. The man she had trusted to provide technical support and understanding the surveillance system had, in fact, been watching everything around her, including her. Shock gave way to determination. Sarah knew Wallace had to be confronted, but she also knew she couldn't go to him directly. He was dangerous, controlling a vast surveillance network and surely aware that she was already too close to the truth. If Wallace was the mentor, he had the resources and knowledge to make anyone disappear, just like he had with Jennifer and Leah. Resolved to act, Sarah formulated a plan. She knew where Patrick lived, a luxury condo not far from Arthur Hale's building. However, she also knew the place would be monitored by cameras, and any approach would be detected. She'd have to be careful. She contacted Harris and his team, asking for discreet backup to surround the area without raising suspicion. As she prepared, the tension in the air was palpable. Sarah knew this confrontation would be dangerous. Patrick Wallace was methodical, someone who operated from the shadows, manipulating every variable around him. If he realized that the police were closing in, everything could spiral out of control. The weight of the latest discoveries hung over her. Every move had to be calculated. Arriving at Wallace's condo, Sarah watched from a distance. The building was modern, with cameras everywhere, exactly as she had expected. The plan was simple: she would go in alone, posing as a casual visitor, while Harris and the team stayed on alert. As she approached the entrance, she could feel the eyes of the surveillance cameras on her, tracking her every step. She pressed the intercom, and without delay, Wallace's voice came through, calm as always. "Detective Mendez, what a surprise. What can I do for you?" His tone was casual, but Sarah knew he was testing her. He knew something was off, but he couldn't refuse the visit without arousing suspicion. "I have a few questions about the Hale case," she replied. "Thought you could help me with some of it." The silence that followed on the other end of the line was brief but heavy. Then the door unlocked. Sarah made her way up to the apartment, trying to stay calm despite the growing tension with each step. Inside, Wallace was waiting for her, a cold smile on his face. "Please, sit down. Make yourself at home. What would you like to talk about?" Sarah couldn't ignore the knot tightening in her stomach. Every movement he made was calculated, his relaxed demeanor masking the true nature of the man sitting in front of her. She started subtly, asking about the building surveillance system and Arthur Hale. Wallace answered calmly, as usual, but something in his eyes told her he knew. He knew she was getting close to the truth. The exchange of words was a tense dance until, without warning, Wallace leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "You really think you're going to solve this, Sarah? I control more than you can imagine. And if you keep digging, you'll end up like all the others." Sarah braced herself for the worst. Wallace's mask had fallen. He was no longer just the friendly security consultant. He was the mentor, the man behind the disappearances. And now, she was face to face with him in the lion's den. Patrick Wallace's apartment, usually a sanctuary of control and sophistication, now felt as though it was closing in on Sarah, suffocating and charged with tension. The man sitting across from her was no longer the Patrick she knew, the helpful, cooperative security consultant. The cold smile on his face and the calculating glint in his eyes revealed the true mentor behind it all. He had hidden in plain sight, manipulating information, people, and fates without ever raising suspicion. Sarah knew there was no more room for subtlety. The game of pretense was over. "You're behind all of this, aren't you?" Her voice came out steady, despite the adrenaline rushing through her veins. Patrick leaned back in his chair, his smile unchanging. "It's always been about control, detective. Always about watching, predicting, adjusting. Some people, like Arthur Hale, were useful pieces, others, like you, are just distractions." He spoke with the calmness of someone who believed they were in complete control. But Sarah knew he had a blind spot. He didn't know Harris and the team were waiting outside, ready to move at the first sign of trouble. As she kept the conversation going, Sarah mentally rehearsed the sequence of events that would need to happen in the next few minutes. She couldn't make a wrong move. Patrick was unpredictable, and for the moment, he held all the cards. His threat, silent and calculated, was as deadly as any weapon. "And the women? What did you do to them?" Sarah kept her eyes fixed on him, trying to control the fury building inside her. Patrick smiled almost indulgently. "The women, Sarah, were always part of the process. Some knew too much, others were just distractions along the way. But they all played their roles in the greater order of things." His smile widened. "Just like you. You knew it would come to this, didn't you? You got too involved." The silence that followed was heavy with menace. Sarah could feel the moment to act was approaching. But before she could plan her next move, Patrick made a swift motion, standing from his chair with a speed she hadn't expected. "You really think I didn't know I was being watched, Sarah?" The smile was gone from his face. "You think I didn't know about your reinforcements? Your cops outside are just as predictable as you." The air in the room seemed to freeze. He knew. Which meant things could unravel quickly. Sarah felt the weight of the gun at her side, but she knew a premature move would be fatal. Before she could react, Patrick moved across the room, a remote in his hand, and with a click, the screens around the room lit up. Surveillance footage showed Harris and the team positioned outside, unaware that they had been discovered. Patrick's smile was one of pure satisfaction. "I'm always in control, Sarah." "Always," he said, taking a step forward. Sarah struggled to remain calm. The situation was falling apart faster than she could control. She needed a way out, but Patrick seemed to have anticipated her every move. The game was dangerously tilted in his favor. But then, a thought struck her. Jennifer. Sarah remembered that Jennifer was still missing, and Patrick had never mentioned what had really happened to her. There might be a chance, one last card he hadn't played yet. "You might have killed Leah Carter, Patrick. You might have gotten rid of those women. But where's Jennifer? What did you do with her?" For a brief moment, Patrick hesitated. It was a fraction of a second, but enough for Sarah to notice she had found a crack. He had been ready to admit to everything, but he hadn't expected her to bring Jennifer into the conversation. Something about Jennifer's disappearance still made him vulnerable. And Sarah knew this was her moment. In one quick motion, she drew her gun, keeping the barrel pointed directly at him. Patrick stepped back, surprised, but soon his smile returned. "You're going to shoot me, Sarah? And then what? You're going to figure this out all on your own? You're already trapped in the web, detective. There's no way out." Before either of them could react, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside the apartment. Harris and his team had breached the building. Patrick heard the commotion and glanced at the screens, watching the officers move into position. His calm started to fracture, and Sarah saw her opening. In one quick motion, she lunged forward, knocking the remote from his hand and pinning him against the wall. "It's over, Patrick. Your network, your surveillance. It's all about to come crashing down," Sarah said, keeping the gun firmly aimed at him as the officers stormed into the apartment. Patrick, still smiling, slowly raised his hands. "You may have caught me, but this isn't the end. I'm only part of something much bigger. And you, Sarah, you still don't understand anything." Those words echoed in Sarah's mind as she cuffed him, trying to hold back her anger. Everything was about to be over, but his words left a shadow in the air. Part of something bigger. What did he mean by that? Patrick was being escorted out by the officers when Sarah took one last look around the apartment. The screens were still showing surveillance feeds, and one of them displayed something that froze her heart. In the basement of Patrick's building, there was a room full of monitoring equipment, and Jennifer, tied to a chair, still alive but clearly weakened. The image cut off suddenly, as the screens went black one by one. Sarah shouted for the officers to hold Patrick. She needed answers. Jennifer was alive, but where? Patrick's final move had been played, and the game was far from over. With her eyes locked on the man who had orchestrated so much destruction, Sarah realized that his words were painfully true. She had won a battle, but the war was far from over. Patrick Wallace's words echoed in Sarah's mind as he was taken away by the police. "I'm just a part of something much bigger." Despite being handcuffed, his cold smile remained, as if he already knew that the game wasn't over. And the last blow he had struck, the sight of Jennifer, alive and tied up somewhere unknown, still hung over Sarah like a dark cloud. As soon as Patrick was placed in the police car, Sarah rushed back to the station, trying to process everything. Jennifer was alive, but where was she? The images from the screens had provided no more clues, and Patrick had refused to talk. She needed immediate answers, and time was of the essence. Each second that ticked by was one less chance to save her friend. Back at the station, Sarah locked herself in her office, spreading out the papers and photographs she had collected. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, but they also hinted at a far more complex reality. The last message from Patrick still resonated in her ears: "This is just the beginning." What did that mean? As Sarah stared at the photos of the missing women, she felt the weight of their stories pressing down on her. The names and faces blended together, but Leah Carter's image still loomed large in her mind. Leah had been investigating the very same disappearances when she vanished. Sarah couldn't help but wonder if there was a connection between her case and Jennifer's. Both had been digging too deep, uncovering secrets that someone wanted to keep buried. Just as Sarah was about to dive back into her thoughts, her phone buzzed with a new message. A number she didn't recognize. Hesitating for a moment, she opened the message, and her heart dropped. It was a simple message, just 2 words, just the beginning. The truth hit her like a tidal wave. Patrick Wallace was right. The threads connecting all these disappearances were only starting to unravel. As she glanced at the bulletin board filled with photographs, Sarah realized that she was now in the middle of a much larger conspiracy. The fear she had felt earlier now morphed into determination. This wasn't just about Jennifer or Leah anymore, it was about all the women who had disappeared and about ensuring that Patrick Wallace and his network of surveillance would face justice. Sarah stepped out of her office and found Harris, her mind set. We need to mobilize. Patrick may be behind bars, but his network is still out there. We can't let them get away with this. We need to find Jennifer, and we need to act fast. Harris nodded, sensing the urgency in her voice. Together, they assembled a team of officers, revisiting the locations where the women had gone missing, checking surveillance footage, and questioning anyone who might have seen anything. The clock was ticking, and the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on Sarah's shoulders. As they combed through the files, an old report caught Sarah's eye. It was a complaint made 2 years ago by a woman who claimed to be followed by a man with a camera. The report had been buried in the archives, overlooked in the frenzy of more recent cases. The woman had mentioned the same black car that Sarah had seen parked outside her own home. Could it have been a connection? With renewed determination, Sarah pulled the report and set out to track down the woman who had filed it. They needed every lead they could find. As they arrived at the address listed in the report, Sarah felt a mix of anticipation and dread. What if this was another dead end? Or worse, what if the woman had become another victim? They knocked on the door of a modest house, and after a moment, a woman in her 30s opened the door, looking weary but curious. "Can I help you?" she asked, eyeing the badge on Sarah's shirt. "We're investigating a series of disappearances and we're hoping you could tell us more about your experience from 2 years ago," Sarah said gently, trying to ease the woman's apprehension. The woman's expression shifted. "You mean the man who followed me? The one with the camera?" She hesitated before stepping aside to let them in. "I thought he was just a photographer. I never thought it was serious, until I found out that several women went missing afterward." Sarah's heart raced. "Can you tell me everything you remember? Every detail matters." As the woman recounted her experience, Sarah felt a mix of horror and urgency building within her. The pieces were coming together, but they were also leading her deeper into the darkness that surrounded Cedar Creek. The sense of being watched returned, creeping into her thoughts as she listened to the chilling details. Hours passed as they gathered information and evidence, piecing together a timeline of events leading back to Patrick and the network he was part of. The woman, once so oblivious to the danger, now seemed to understand the stakes at play. When Sarah and Harris left the house, it was nearly dark. The weight of their findings hung heavy in the air. They had a name, a lead, and more importantly, they were inching closer to unraveling the mystery. But as they made their way back to the station, the message echoed in Sarah's mind, just the beginning. This was far from over, and the true danger was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The night had settled over Cedar Creek by the time Sarah finally returned home. The weight of the case still hung heavily on her shoulders, but now there was a new burden. Jennifer was alive, but for how long? And how far did Patrick Wallace's network really reach? He was behind bars, but the feeling that this was far from over lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake. The dim light of her apartment barely cut through the darkness as she stepped inside. She took a deep breath, trying to clear her mind. Patrick's taunting words echoed again in her thoughts, "I'm just a part of something much bigger." That smile, that cold certainty, still haunted her. She had caught him, but who else was out there, pulling the strings? As she moved through her apartment, her phone buzzed. She glanced down, her breath catching in her throat. It was another message from an unknown number. This one, however, contained no words, just an image. It was a grainy photo of Sarah herself, taken from a distance. The timestamp showed that it had been taken just hours ago. Her heart pounded in her chest. Even now, after everything, she was still being watched. The network was still in place, still operating in the shadows. And whoever had sent the message wanted her to know it. She looked out the window, her eyes scanning the darkened street below, searching for any sign of movement. The silence felt too heavy, too deliberate. The invisible enemy was still out there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Sarah knew that this was far from over. Patrick's capture was only the beginning. She stepped away from the window, her thoughts racing. The war had just begun, and she had no choice but to keep fighting. Cedar Creek wasn't safe. No one was, not yet. And as the night closed in around her, Sarah understood one thing clearly: the enemy was always watching.